everyone. So this, just to remind you, this is our final share of the Zman, I think I can call it, and we'll restart Emir Hashem sometime near the beginning of September, mid Elul time. I think I wanted to finish off the discussion from last share, and then open up one new topic for discussion, just to draw to a close the first part of the sugya of Ofeh / Mevashel. The topic I was looking at was the difference between the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which is talking about Bishul Akum, and the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, which is talking about the melachot of Bishul. And basically, the two Gemaras are reversed. They're the reverse of each other. So whilst our Gemara says that Haiman Deshota Sichsel Atuna Mao Deteim Leshuri Monikam Achavim Kamashmalon Demir Parapi. So our Gemara says that the Havamina Maskana is that we would have thought that his Kavana is to harden, Kamashmalon that the Kavana is to soften. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah says the opposite. We would have thought that the Kavana is to be Mevashel, to cook. The Kamashmalon is Lishuri Monikam Achavim, that the intention is to harden. So we looked last time at the answer of the Tosfos stroke the Ritva, who say that with Bishul Akum we follow the Ikka Kavana, the main intention, whereas with Shabbos we follow, because of Menachas Shabbos, we even follow the subsidiary intention. We then saw the view of the Ran, who says that with respect to Shabbos there's an Issa of Psik Reisha even without being Mechavein, whereas with Bishul Akum there isn't the Issa of Psik Reisha without being Mechavein, without having intention. Whereas with Shabbos, as I said, where it's an inevitable result, there is. That led us to a discussion based in the run of the link between the softening and the hardening, the fact that it's not just a side Psik Reisha, but it's an inevitable part of the Tahalich, the very process of manufacturing the peg. I then mentioned very briefly Rashi, and Rashi says, I think it was Edward's point actually, I think Edward mentioned it also. Rashi says that a simple answer, he says Bishul Akum is about cooking food, not cooking kalim, and therefore the machshava, the intention of the Akum, the pagan, to cook a keli is not relevant over here. And somehow Rashi reads that into the answer of the Gemara. He probably reads the answer of the Gemara with a different tune, such that the stress of the answer of the Gemara in Avodah Zarah is that we're talking here about Lishuri Monokom Achavin. The intention is to do something to a utensil as opposed to food. That's how Rashi would stress the Gemara. The final answer, which I think we ran out of time and we didn't have a look at, and therefore I just want to spend a moment or two talking about, is the answer of Tosfos Rid. The Tosfos Rid, I put in the source sheet both the language of the Tosfos Rid here in Masechet Shabbat, and also the language of the Tosfos Rid in Avodah Zarah. Now, originally when I read the Tosfos Rid, I was tempted to read it as saying the same as Rashi, because Tosfos Rid says, "L'inyan bishul akum ein choshev bishul elo haroi la'achila." The bishul akum is only with something where it's roi la'achila, where it's suitable for eating. So I thought the Tosfos Rid is saying the same as Rashi, that if you're doing it with food, that's Bishul Akum. If you're not doing it with food, it may be Menachas Shabbos, but it's not relevant to Bishul Akum. However, I don't believe this is the correct reading in the sugya, in the Tosfos Rid, because Tosfos Rid carries on and he says, "V'lo yizeh Mevashel hamakol kedei l'chazkoi." Not this case over here, where you are cooking the makol, the stick, the peg, in order to strengthen it. So the Tosfos Rid's chiluk is not between food versus a stick, because Tosfos Rid says that hu hadin, food versus, he says the reason you're not chayiv over here is because your intention is to harden the stick, not to soften the stick. And therefore I think the Tosfos Rid is al derech the Shitur Aran, that the point over here is that the bishul is a step in a process which will lead to something happening which is not similar to bishul of food. In other words, were I doing to the stick something which was similar to the bishul of food, then enochanami, even with a stick, I would be chayiv. Rashi says the chiluk is the object. Is the object I'm cooking food, or is the object I'm cooking a utensil? The Tosfos Rid says the chiluk is the cooking. Is it a bishul haroi la'achila? Is it the sort of cooking which is suitable for eating, or is it the sort of cooking which is not suitable for eating? Meaning to say, with the Shabbos, you can say, what's the step that's actually happening? And the answer is, even though my end goal is to harden it, but in the meantime I'm cooking it. But with respect to bishul akum, we need to say, is this a bishul process which is an oichel type bishul process? And the answer is, it's not an oichel type bishul process, because my intention is to take it to a next stage. It's part of a talich, part of a process, and my intention is to take it to a next stage at which it will cease to be an oichel type bishul. What will it be in the next stage? Well, that gets to the machlokes rishonim that we saw. And maybe it's a told of bishul. It may be that the whole bishul over here is the softening process that happens in the interim, or it may be that the final process of hardening is a different sort of bishul. It's the bishul of changing the function. But either way, it's not the type of bishul which is relevant to oichlim, and therefore the Tosfos Rid says bishul akum wouldn't apply. So it would appear that Rashi learns that the gezerah of bishul akum is linked to the object. Is it an object of food or an object of a utensil? So Tosfos Rid says it's linked to the type of bishul. Is it a food type of bishul or not a food type of bishul? So that seems to me a reasonable reading in Tosfos Rid, and that brings to a conclusion really the first subtopic I want to discuss in this sugya, which is the relationship between our sugya and avodah zarah. I'll just pause there in case there are any comments about that, but and if not, I'll carry on. Okay, the final topic I want to discuss is a fascinating one. It's not a sugya that I was really aware of until this time round in preparing the shiur. And I want to emphasize that some of the Maramakomis I'm bringing are not my own discovery. I saw these in various Likut Sfarim. I unfortunately don't have enough of the knowledge in Torah to have found these Maramakomis myself. But as I said, I found them in other sources, and I really just want to share them with you. And this is a sugya I was not really aware of until I saw them brought in the Achronim that speak about our topic. And this is the question of cooking when the object you're cooking becomes consumed in the process. And I think you can see why this is relevant to our topic. What happens if the object that I'm cooking is consumed, is eaten up in the process of cooking? Now, in the stick case, in the case of hardening the peg, it isn't such a case. The peg is not hardened, is not consumed through the process of cooking. However, in a few minutes, you will see why I still think this is relevant to our topic. Nonetheless, we did discuss when we spoke about the peg, about why melacha. Every melacha has to have a form of teitzah, which has some permanence to it. Here the teitzah seems temporary, because it's true the peg becomes softened, but then it becomes harder, and we discussed that previously. So the simplest way of learning our sugya is that it's not an example of something that's consumed through cooking. But what do I mean by something that's consumed through cooking? Well, for example, if I light a lantern, a candle, or an oil lamp, the melacha I've done is normally considered to be havara, which is burning, creating a fire, a flame. However, it would appear that another melacha has also occurred, which is bishul, because the oil is heated up through the flame. The flame heats up the oil to well above Yad Siledes, and then, of course, it burns the oil, which is what creates the flame. So through lighting the flame, I'm doing two things. I'm both cooking the oil and doing bishul on the oil. Now, the Achronim discuss this shaila, and the first Maramakim that I printed on the source sheet, as I said, not my own Maramakim, but one that I still cited and looked up, is from the Chai Adam, who talks about this issue. And in the footnote of the Nishmas Adam, the footnotes that the Chai Adam wrote on his own halachic work, he addresses this topic, and this was on the final source sheet that I gave out, source sheet 4 on the sugya, and he brings a diuk from our Rashi. And the diuk, he says, is is the language of Rashi. Rashi says, "Hishlich yosed lach latano cham leyavshoy sheiskasha." he threw the peg onto into the hot kiln, into the hot oven, in order to harden it, to dry it so that it will harden. And the Chai Adam, in a remarkable diuk, this is a nuance of language of Rashi that I completely missed until pointed out by the Chai Adam. The Chai Adam says, he says, even if you left it to burn, in other words, you wanted to burn the peg, you should still be chayav from Mevashel, because that it is an inevitable consequence of what will happen. So the Chai Adam wants to prove from here, the Nishmat Adam wants to prove from here, that since you intend to consume it in the process, rather than just, it says, Gemara Shalom Polig, our Gemara argues on the Yerushalmi that he brings, and holds that a peg or something which you are consuming in the process of bishul ceases to be bishul and becomes the melacha of havara. So says the Nishmas Adam, the Chai Adam. I also printed a Chasam Sofer, and the Chasam Sofer talks about the poskim who speak about a candle made of basar b'cholov. Now, they used to make candles, as you know, from tallow wax, from animal fat, and other such things. And he talks about what happens if you have a tallow candle, a fat candle, made with chelev, fat. By the way, when you read this tshuva of the Chasam Sofer, you have to be careful. In each case, you know whether the word he's saying is cholov, milk, because the issue is basar b'cholov, or chelev, fat. Now, the difference between chelev, which is not allowed to be eaten, and basar b'cholov, milk and meat, which is not allowed to be eaten, is that chelev is an isser achila, basar b'cholov is an isser bishul also. The pasuk says, Mevashel gedi b'chalei memoi, that one also can't cook basar b'cholov. So he's interested in the topic of whether cooking a candle which contains basar b'cholov is a problem, because in the process lighting a candle, burning a candle which contains basar b'cholov, is a problem because you are also cooking the basar b'cholov. And it's a very beautiful teshuvah in which he speaks about the topic of ein issa chalal issa, because this meat in this candle is chelev, it's fat, and therefore it's anyway osa. Can a second issa settle or apply once there's already a first issa there? Nonetheless, he discusses the issue of bishul basar b'cholov. He then goes on to talk about Shabbos. And he says, well, what about with respect to Shabbos? Is it the malacha of bishul every time you cook a candle, every time you burn a candle or oil, because you're also cooking the oil? And he says, lo yishtamit milsa, it's not possible that for 3,500 years of Jewish learning, this was forgotten to be mentioned. In other words, if you want to suggest that there would be bishul in such a case, it's inconceivable, because we have hundreds of pages of Psak Halacha, we've got tens of pages of Gemaras that talk about the issue of Havara and the melacha of burning candles and burning oil, and everyone forgot to mention that there's another melacha floating around over here of bishul. This is ridiculous. This can't be the case. No sugya that deals with Havara ever thought to mention the issue of bishul, and therefore the Chasam Sofer is absolutely convinced there's no melacha of bishul in this case. Why would there then be no melacha of bishul? After all, he's just had to hold teshuvah, which assumes that there is bishul with basar b'cholov. So he reminds us again of a principle we've met many times, which is that when it comes to other isurim in the Torah, it's the act of bishul, or the result of bishul in the sense of the mechanical activity of cooking. However, when it comes to melacha, a melacha is an asek, it's an engagement with an activity to produce a particular creative outcome. And therefore we need to see whether the creative outcome is achieved. And he says that we learn the source of melachas bishul is from the Mishkan, where there was bishul samamonim, and we never find bishul in the Mishkan where the object was consumed through the bishul. And therefore he says the melacha of bishul of Shabbos doesn't apply when the object is consumed. Now I want to stress again that even though the Chasam Sofer writes this sounding as if he's saying a gezeras hakosov, this is a sort of mechanical application of taking the concepts of Mishkan and applying them to Shabbos. That isn't the case. We can never just learn mechanically from the Mishkan. The Mishkan has to be a crowbar or a source to crack open a svara, a piece of reasoning. you couldn't argue that just because in the Mishkan, all the people doing the melacha, let's say the melacha of carrying, were Leviim. Therefore, these melachas only apply to Leviim. Or the stuff that they were bringing was diamonds and gold and material and fabrics for the Mishkan, and therefore carrying wouldn't apply if you bring plastic, because plastic wasn't around in the time of the Mishkan. The chiluk, the distinction that we draw, is not enough to point out a difference. It has to be a distinction. Not every difference is a distinction. So you can't just randomly say because something didn't happen in the Mishkan, it therefore wouldn't apply in the application to Hilchos Shabbos. So the Chasam Sofer is saying a svara over here. More than that, if he's just randomly, sort of mechanically saying it didn't happen in the Mishkan, well, the answer is it did happen in the Mishkan, because in the Mishkan they burn things. And therefore, if you're going to argue that we learn from the Mishkan, well, who says we should just learn Havara from the Mishkan, that they burnt things in the Mishkan? Maybe learn that in that process, Bishul also took place. So there's something circular about the Chasam Sofer's argument. You can't argue that doesn't count as Bishul when you cook oil that's burning when you cook oil because it gets consumed, because the bishul that we find in the Mishkan wasn't a case where it got consumed because it was the bishul of the herbs used for the dyeing process where they don't get consumed, because that's the whole point over here. Well, maybe the Havara that we find in the Mishkan then should be the source of a bishul where things do become consumed. So the Pshat of the Chasam Sofer is he's using the Mishkan as a way of saying this isn't merely a difference, but this is also a distinction. Because there's a svara over here, which is Shabbos, Melachot Shabbos is about a creative outcome, and the creative outcome of Bishul is remaining with something cooked, not a process in which it becomes consumed through so doing. So this is a very powerful Chasam Sofer. Chasam Sofer, it doesn't need my recommendation, very, very senior and important posek, who is absolutely convinced, both from the Mishkan and from Svara and from the fact that 3,500 years of halachic literature, it was always forgotten to mention that there's Bishul over here. And therefore, the Nishmas Adam and the Chasam Sofer are sure that there's no bishul in the case where it becomes consumed.
And may I just ask? We had a discussion a few weeks ago about, I think you're suggesting that one of the explanations of Rashi might be applying to in terms of the stick, which is that it was the bishul of the water which was taking place, and that was the act of bishul. That seems to go against the idea of the Chatan Sofer, because the water is disappearing into steam. It's no longer there. So is there
absolutely, and this is why I wanted to bring this topic over here, because it's a fascinating subject that came to my attention, and I am deeply bothered by this Chasam Sofer. We have two really important poskim. We have a Nishmas Adam, and we have a Chasam Sofer who established this as a halachic principle, that there is no bishul when it becomes consumed. And Rashi on the Rif, and arguably Rashi in our Sugya itself, seem to imply that we are talking about the water being evaporated out of the stick, and then the water becoming boiled, and of course eventually being boiled off. This seems to be explicit in the Rashi on the Rif, and once we saw Rashi on the Rif, I opened up the possibility that this is what Rashi on our page meant, even though this wasn't an intuitive way of reading our Rashi. And this seems to flatly contradict this halachic principle, because Rashi on the Rif, that has the status of an anonymous Rishon, seems to say explicitly that when you boil the water such that it then becomes evaporated off, because that's the whole point of it, that would also be the melachot of Bishul. More than that, who was it who opened my eyes to seeing that this may even be Peshat in Rashi on our Gemara, our Rashi, not just Rashi on the Rif? It was the Chasam Sofer himself. So I don't know what to make of this. The Chasam Sofer himself, if we needed proof that the Chasam Sofer knew the Rashi on the Rif, the Chasam Sofer knew everything. He didn't know Rashi on the Rif. Chasam Sofer was again, we have to be careful when we compare Achronim, but the Chasam Sofer is viewed as of towering status in the world of Psak. It's hard to describe his seniority, as it were, in the halachic world. The Chasam Sofer knew these things. But if we need proof for it, the Chasam Sofer knew this Rashi on the Rif, and seems to learn that Rashi by us is talking about a metal peg, if you remember, and seems to talk about the liquid being evaporated off the metal peg. So this is a pella, this is an absolute wonder, because it seems clear to me that, let's leave our Rashi out, because the Rashi as we have it is a little unclear, but Rashi on the Rif is explicit against the view of the Chasam Sofer and the Nishmas Adam, and I have no answer to that question.
Could there be a difference when there's a Havara? So you've got a flame on something, and burning something, that is different to boiling something away. I mean, would we really suggest that if we boiled a pot of water to the point that it evaporated, that would not be a bishul? That would be very hard to suggest.
I think that is absolutely right. And between Geoffrey and Paul now, we're saying the Shiur. But I'm going to say this. The Chasam Sofer's strength of feeling that it's impossible that 3,500 years forgot to mention that every time you burn a candle, it's also bishul, I think he doesn't need my agreement, but I think it's absolutely correct. And I think there's a difference between burning and evaporating. The problem is the Chasam Sofer and the Yeshiva-style don't seem to say that. They seem to say that a bishul which destroys in the process of bishul is not a bishul. Now, what do they mean by that? Do they mean that if you boil something away, you're not chayiv for bishul? I don't know. But I would say, is it possible that in 3,000 years of halachic literature, no one ever told us that? And there seems to be an alternative answer to a way of distinguishing between burning and boiling, which I'll share in a moment. But before I say that, I just want to say that, again, it was drawn to my attention through the writing of the Achronim that there's another Rishon that seems to say this explicitly, and this is a Tosus Rosh in Yevamos, which I printed on the source sheet. I'll just explain it to you outside. The Tosus Rosh is talking about a Gezerah D'Rabbanan. And the Gezerah D'Rabbanan is that you are not allowed to read by the light of an oil candle on Shabbos, because when people read or learn, they become very focused on the learning, and without thinking, if the lamp is unclear, you may tilt the lamp or adjust it in order to get a better flame going, and you will therefore be mechalel Shabbos, and therefore one shouldn't read right next to the oil lamp, such that there's a fear that you will end up being mechalel Shabbos. And the Tosus Rosh discusses which melacha are we talking about over here. What would be the problem with causing more oil to flow into the wick? You're not lighting a flame, you're simply pouring more fuel on the fire. Would this be the melachah of avara? And the Tosus Rosh says explicitly that it is Mevashel shemen. So this is a further source contradicting this idea of the Chasam Sofer, a further Rishon that seems to contradict the source of Chasam Sofer. The Tosus Rosh was not accessible to all the Achronim. The manuscript of the Tosus Rosh was not around Europe at every stage. It may be that the Chasam Sofer was unaware of this Tosus Rosh. I don't know. One would need to research this particular manuscript and know in Yevamos and know when it was found. But what do we have over here? So Rashi on the Rif, and perhaps our Rashi, seem to say that boiling to the point of evaporation is the melacha of bishul, contra the Chasam Sofer and the Nishmas, who say that burning to the point of destruction is not the melachah of avara, and seem to extend that to any case where you where you burn off the thing that you are boiling. It is possible, therefore, in Rashi to make Geoffrey's chiluk and argue that there's a chiluk between burning and boiling. And one simple way of explaining this chiluk is the principle that Josh mentioned last time and that we've used on previous occasions, which is you have to decide which malacha is this. What is the primary act that defines the asek I'm engaged in? Now, it is true that if I was doing nothing else, we would say that this is a psik reisha of boiling, because things that burn always get boiled first, or liquids that burn anyway, always get boiled first, and therefore there's always a bishul before the havara. But since this is intrinsic to the process of havara, it is reasonable to say that the process of havara supersedes the bishul that takes place and defines and redefines the whole action that takes place. So if I have oil, it's very interesting, if I have oil and I light it in order to cook it, I would be chayiv for bishul. If I stop there, if I let the process carry on, then retroactively that would define the nature of the whole asek as havara rather than the bishul. And this would answer why 3,500 years of halachic literature didn't mention that every havara is also bishul, as per the Chasam Sofer's question, but not going as far as the Chasam Sofer. We are, through Rashi, facing a clash with the Chasam Sofer, because the Chasam Sofer seems to extend this even to boiling, whereas in Rashi we would say the svara is not like the Chasam Sofer. The Chasam Sofer says the svara is that anything that's destroyed in the process of cooking, that's not cooking, that's not the melachah of bishul. But then that would apply even to boiling. Whereas the svara we're saying is that havara, burning, is not boiling. However, if I boil and then it evaporates, that is still bishul, and therefore I would be chayiv for that. So this is the first point, I would say, remains a pella to me, because this is not like the Chasam Sofer, but it's a good answer to how Rashi would answer the Chasam Sofer's question, which is, whoa, if Rashi holds that you are chayav for evaporating water, why aren't you always chayav for bishul every time you burn an oil lamp? The answer is an oil lamp is different to boiling. The Tosfos Rosh is a deeper clash with the Chasam Sofer, because the Tosfos Rosh is talking about burning an oil lamp. And that which the Chasam Sofer says, that no one ever mentioned that burning an oil lamp is also bishul, we have a Rosh who does mention that burning an oil lamp is also bishul, and that's definitely a head-on clash with the Chasam Sofer and Nishmas Adam, because that's even talking about burning a lamp. Though again, the weight of Tosfos Rosh and halachic, the Rosh himself is a very important halachic rishon. The Tosfos Rosh, which is the collection of Tosfos the Rosh had, many of the Tosfos Rosh and Shas enter halachic literature less, because as I said, the manuscript was lost for many hundreds of years, and therefore it didn't have the same impact on halacha. Either way, we have a Tosfos Rosh about a potential issa deraisa, melacha deraisa, who seems to argue with the Chasam Sofer, and I think this is an important topic. Now, having said that, the Chasam Sofer's question still rings true on the Tosfos Rosh. Why is this never discussed, that every havara is also bishul? And it could be, I was thinking, that even the Tosfos Rosh would agree that every havara is not a bishul, because as we said before, the melacha of havara supersedes the bishul and defines the act as an asek of havara rather than bishul. The Tosfos Rosh is talking about one unique case, which is the circumstance where of tilting the lamp. And in that case, the Tosfos Rosh says that the melacha isn't a havara, because I'm just adding the fuel. So there the Tosfos Rosh would say, what's the melacha? The melacha is bishul, because what am I doing? I'm adding the fuel, which goes through the bishul process, rather than it just being a havara. But even the Tosfos Rosh would agree in a situation where I'm lighting, and it's a classic havara, there the Tosfos Rosh would agree it's a havara, not a bishul. And that way we maintain the core point of the Chasam Sofer, that it's lo yatachin, it's not possible that every havara when I light an oil lamp is it also a bishul. But nonetheless, as we see from both the Tosfos Rosh and Rashi, there isn't a principle that just because something is kola, is evaporated or destroyed through the process, it can't be a bishul. The Chasam Sofer seems to say it as a general rule, but we see from Rashi it's perhaps the true in havara. But there are cases of bishul where even where you destroy it, it does become it is a melacha of bishul. And I don't know a way of avoiding the fact that there are Rishonim who disagree with the Chasam Sofer on this idea. We've run out of our time there, so I will conclude simply with, I think it's a fascinating sugya of which I was unaware, the issue of when you do a melacha of bishul, which burns and consumes the whole entity, whether that's the melacha of bishul. I wish all of us a meaningful tanis. There is a little inyana dioma over here in this discussion, which is that we talk about the tragic burning of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, the Beis HaMikdash was made of stone. How does stone burn? And the answer is it was made of a limestone, which has a high water content, and the descriptions of the burning of the Beis HaMikdash describe that wood was piled up next to it such that it evaporated the water dried out the stone, evaporated the water, and therefore caused the stone to crumble. That's what we mean when we talk about the Beis HaMikdash burning. I mentioned that just as an aside, since it's literally the topic of the sugya we are discussing. But clearly, we've just enjoyed the Simcha of Torah on Tisha B'Av itself. We're not allowed to learn Torah. I wish all of us a meaningful and positive fast, a fast that we're able to use for that which it's meant to be used for. And the Mitzvah Hashem will resume in Chodesh Elul.